We were talking earlier about the modern day slavery worldwide, and we're going to expand on that just a bit. I'm joined now by Fiona David of the Walk Free Foundation. She's Executive Director of Global Research there. In our Insight segment, we were talking about it. According to your organization, India has the most people enslaved at more than 18 million. In what industries are slaves being used in places like India, would you say?
Look, it's an extraordinary statistic, isn't it? Globally, we actually found that there's some 45 million people living in some form of modern slavery. So yes, India has the biggest problem, but India is not alone in this issue. The sorts of industries that we see very heavily implicated in slavery today are agriculture, construction, manufacturing, but of course, some of the informal sectors like domestic work and the sex industry.
You said extraordinary, and I think it's rather extraordinary that you even have these statistics, because I would think it would be rather difficult given much of this is under the radar.
Look, it's an incredibly hard task to measure something as hidden as modern slavery. What we do is we do household surveys on a random sample basis. So that literally means somebody from any part of India could have been chosen, for example, for our 15 state surveys in India. And we ask people about their experiences of what you and I would call forced labour, but also forced marriage. So we're gathering this information very directly from people. Of course, most people we speak to have not had these experiences and report that they haven't. We get our estimates based on the small percentage of people who report, yes, they have had this experience of forced labour or they have had this experience of forced marriage.
Fiona, what are the factors that are driving modern slavery?
We see some of the major factors today, including conflict. So, of course, conflict such as the situation in Iraq and Syria is driving mass displacement of people. We're seeing people moving in horrendously risky situations. Just this week in New York, a very brave young woman, Nadia Murat, spoke to the UN General Assembly about her experience as a sex slave, as a Yazidi woman, as a sex slave at the hands of ISIS. That is a terrible example, but it really does paint that picture of how conflict, rule of law, and just extreme lawlessness can lead to these situations of slavery.
And how do you break the chains of slavery given that?
Look, I think we have to try new strategies. We need to not be surprised when we're going into conflict situations that slavery happens. We know that slavery happens, whether it's from the Second World War experience or more recently in Nigeria with the kidnapping of the Boko Haram Chibok girls, or the ISIS situation in Iraq. We know that slavery is going to happen in conflict situations. We need to prepare and make it part of the humanitarian response. So that's the first very important point. Secondly, governments are starting to look for newer ways to approach this issue. Of course, slavery has been criminalised for hundreds of years in many countries, but what hasn't been tackled is the business side. So we're seeing some countries like the United Kingdom introducing laws which make it basically the responsibility of companies to look at what are the goods and services they're buying and selling, who's making them, what are their labour conditions, and we call this supply chain transparency legislation, which is really a fancy name for companies doing due diligence on who's making and producing the goods and services that they are buying. So I think supply chain transparency legislation is very new. It's only in place in the United Kingdom and in California so far, but I think we'll see it spreading to a lot of other countries around the world.
It's certainly important. Fiona David joining us from the Australian capital of Canberra. Thanks so much.